I'm Devin Mogler. I'm SVP of Government Relations, Sustainability, and Communications at Green Plains. We operate 11 biorefineries across the U.S., including 2 here in Iowa, in Shenandoah and Superior. Our next speaker is going to provide us with some expert insight into a part of the world that's impacting all of our lives. Russia's incursion into Ukraine has sent shockwaves through global commodity and energy markets. Dr. Yuval Weber is the Distinguished Fellow at the Marine Corps University in Quantico, Virginia. He is the subject matter expert on the Russian military and political strategy. If I went through all of his current affiliations and past positions that span from Washington, D.C. to Harvard to Moscow, he would have no time to speak. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Weber to the 2023 IRFA Summit.
So thanks very much. Okay. So first of all, good morning. I wanted to thank, first of all, Monty and Lisa for the kind invitation and for handling during this period. And I'd also like to thank all the previous speakers, Mr. Geese, Mr. Cooper, and especially Governor Reynolds, as well as the previous panelists. As we get going, I am just super excited to be here because when I wear my Marine Corps University hat, I have to answer a lot of really specific tactical level questions. I also teach at Texas A&M University's Bush School of Government and Public Service, which has just opened up a location in Washington, D.C. And through the policy process, I'm always engaging in big strategic level issues. And the thing I really enjoy the most about events like this is I get to break out of both of those things and really try to understand and learn from what is going on in industry. And so with that in mind, the presentation that will show up in just a second here, I made it for today. This will be available. As you see, my email address should be up in one of these slides. You can feel free to email me, just yuvalweber@gmail.com, or you can ask Lisa from the Iowa Renewable Fuels Association, and she has the exact same thing. So feel free to ask away. So where we started here is ultimately, as Devin was saying a moment ago, when we think about, in effect, what is going on in the Russia-Ukraine relationship, as well as Russia's ability to just exist in the world today, what we're observing in real time is the end of the post-Soviet era. And we'll go through the history in just a second here, but we're on the cusp of a brand new era of international relations in which Russia's ability to survive as a great power is under tremendous risk. And that's really sort of the mind frame of what we'll do for the rest of the discussion. So if we can get the slides back up. So where we start here is we can see top left. This is Vladimir Putin in the speech in which he recognizes the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, which sort of catalyzed the war. It's at this point in the speech, or this point in his TV address, in which he's saying Ukraine does not exist. That's essentially the moment where he is at the height of his particular confidence. And where we see over the course of, going clockwise, that's of course President Zelensky of Ukraine. That is when he went to Bucha and saw what the Russian occupying army did when they were trying to take over Kyiv. The two people at the bottom right there, and obviously you can see the anguish on his face. And when we think later on, like where I'll end on is, how might this war end? One of the things to keep in mind is that from the Ukrainian point of view, any territory that they don't gain back, that is their Ukrainian territory, is they're leaving Ukrainian citizens to essentially be part of the next Bucha. And that's essentially why the Ukrainians are fighting for all of their territory. The two people at the bottom right there, they may not be recognizable unless you're a macro finance nerd, but the lady in the back, that is the head of the Russian central bank. And the person in the front, that is the main economic advisor to the president. So basically the equivalent of the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, and something like the chair of economic advisors here in the US. It's their job to pay for this war. And so when we think about Russia as an energy superpower, they're the ones who have to come up with the bright ideas when the structure of the international energy markets, which I'll end on today because that's of interest to you, they're in a bad place as well. And obviously, as we can see from the bottom left, the reason they're in a bad place, the reason that Russia's in a bad place, is that Russia's invasion is not going as well as they wanted. in a sort of very vicious version of Gilligan's Island, they anticipated that this would be a 3-day operation. We are now approaching the 1-year anniversary of a 3-day invasion. So right here. So really what I wanted to do, and again, is to try to organize this around 4 different questions and provide you the answers as well. What is Russia's grand strategy? In essence, what motivates President Putin? What motivates the entire political elite of Russia? And as Devin was mentioning, I lived for about 4.5 years in Moscow. I went there for 1 year to do research for my dissertation, and it turned out that Moscow, 1, is an insanely wild place to live, and if you like wild things, as I do, then 1 year turned into 4. But it was also at the cusp of Putin and Medvedev. You remember his previous prime minister, who's briefly the president. It was when they were switching back. People went out onto the streets. And essentially the anger that President Putin was demonstrating at every public event is how angry he was at the Russian people for being so ungrateful to not welcome him back. And so when the events in Euromaidan in Kyiv, in 2014 happened, part of that was trying to connect to a different part of Russia, the part of Russia that looks very fondly on basically the imperial past. And so what is Russia's grand strategy? Overcoming the collapse of the Soviet Union and getting the United States, getting us to view Russia as a great power. And the Russian view of a great power is a country that has, independent foreign policy, it can project power all across the world, but that fundamentally questions of European and international security can't be answered without Russia. That's essentially the core thing what's motivating all this. The reality that for the last 30-odd years, the world has moved on without Russia. To stop and reverse that, that's what is the motivation here. And so then we'll get to what led to the war against Ukraine. It was the threat of a good example. If Ukraine could, in effect, become a normal European country, and Russians think about Ukrainians in the same way maybe people from New York think about people from Alabama, if these people who are less sophisticated than us can do something that we don't think is right and available to us, then what does that say about Putin and his entire government, his entire way of organizing Russian society? So to ensure that Ukraine wasn't successful to control that country, that's essentially the motivation here. And so then we'll get to what's going on over the past year. How's the war going? Where might it lead? As I said, we're in a new era of international relations. So Russia's going to, and Putin, he's going to fight or have Russia fight until there are no more Russians left. Because his view is that Ukraine will run out of its people first before he will run out of his population. And so then we'll get to what is core for you guys. This is a crazy moment in international energy history because we're observing 2 things that didn't seem possible for at least the last 50 years. One is that Europe is decoupling from Russian energy. And Mr. Cooper mentioned this to some extent. This is not to say that Europe will never import, a single, cubic meter of gas or single barrel of oil from Russia, but will it go from 50 to 60% to something like 5, 10, 15, in which Russia is just part of the energy profile of Europe? That's basically where we are today. And so in effect, to do this, the broader West, led by us, the United States, effectively created a buyer's cartel. This, of course, has upset OPEC more than anyone else, but to the extent that what we're observing, at least for the next couple of years, is that as long as Russia keeps this war going, we're going to see a lot of softness, a lot of low oil prices. I know that doesn't work well for you guys, but that's in effect what is happening here. So just to level set, because we haven't thought about essentially Russia seriously in quite a long time. Obviously here, remember when Time magazine was something that you read every single week no matter what? We see at the top left there, building a new world. This is from December 1989. Obviously, in the preceding weeks, the Berlin Wall had fallen. And obviously, the Soviet Red Army did not make sure that the governments of Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria were not keeping up their socialist governments. And so the two leaders of the world at that time, the US President, Soviet General Secretary, they meet in Malta, and in effect, President Bush has one question for him. It's one thing for Czechoslovakia to throw off its socialist government. It's another thing for, Hungary, Bulgaria, as I said. But what about East Germany? This is the Warsaw Pact's crown jewel. It is Soviet forward defense, is based on East Germany. And I'm sure some of you folks who had served in the military up through the 1990s probably did some time in West Germany. And Gorbachev at that time tells them, every country will find its own way to socialism. I'm not going to intervene anywhere because my interest is in making the Soviet Union great again. Perestroika, glasnost, these are the things that I need in order to turn my society and my economy around. And obviously President Bush is very pleased by that. And where we go then is that when Gorbachev walks away from that meeting, he's thinking, I'm the leader of the Soviet Union. I just met with the leader of the United States. The Cold War is over. We don't have to spend as much on defense. And what we're going to spend the next years, even decades doing is figuring out the new rules of the road. We are still the second leading power in the world. We still have a military of, well more than 2 million at that point. It's going to be us and the Americans trying to figure out how do we live together in a more peaceful way. That is, in a sense, the exact moment that President Putin has been trying to recapture for the last 20 plus years. Because as Gorbachev leaves Malta, thinking that he's going to be dealing with the American president for the next number of years, the reality of it is by giving up the Soviet Union's external empire, all those buffer state countries in Central and Eastern Europe, it unleashes the same forces at home. Because you get the Lithuanians, you get the Georgians, you get the Ukrainians saying, well, we were just conquered at different points rather than at the end of World War II. Do we have to stay in the Soviet Union? And chief among those people is, if you see in the bottom left there, that's Gorbachev and obviously Boris Yeltsin. And in terms of Soviet disunion, Yeltsin says, as the leader of Russia, not only is the Soviet Union bad, the people that it's worst for are the Russians themselves. We're essentially paying to subsidize everybody else. And that is essentially the core of how the Soviet Union falls apart. Yeltsin takes advantage of Russian nationalism. And then in the bottom right there, that's actually the papers being signed that pull Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine out of the Soviet Union. And that's the moment when we see the picture of them of Yeltsin and Gorbachev. Just close your eyes for a second, think of your boss, and then stick your finger in his or her face while telling them the business. And now imagine doing it on live national television. This is in effect the gap between what Gorbachev thought he was going to get, dealing with the Americans, for the next couple of years or decades, and what he actually got. The country itself falling apart. And so this is their grievance. They thought they would get 1989, they actually got 1991. The world moved on without them. We see there President Bush with then President Yeltsin, and in effect, the world that the Russians received is a world that didn't need Russia. Whereas Gorbachev thought, we may be number 2, the Americans are clearly number 1, but the distance from number 2 to number 3 is so great that it doesn't really matter. And the answer is, Russia falls even further than that. And so the way that they talk about it to themselves, and this is something that I probably heard somewhere in the neighborhood of 100,000 to 1 million times when I was living in Russia, is that you get this argument from the Russians. We ended the Cold War. We ended the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. We ended the Soviet Union. And what did you give us for it? You gave us nothing. And so a lot of the anger that they feel, the resentment, the grievances that they've built up over these years, they've channeled it into basically the sense of the Americans essentially kicked us while we were down and then stood over us for all this time. And there's simply no way to cooperate meaningfully with the United States. And so the key issues at that time, if you remember James Carville, Obviously, his candidate, Governor Clinton, was going against George H.W. Bush, who had overseen the peaceful end of the Cold War, the Gulf War I, the defeat of Iraq, and the peaceful end of the Soviet Union. And so, obviously, why would he? This is one of the best foreign policy presidents we've ever had. That's why Carville said to all the surrogates, whatever the question is, it's the economy, stupid, is the answer. Always pivot to Governor Clinton's relative strength. No big apology, and recession at that time, no big apology from the Russians, unclear how much is enough. So our policy at that time is just focus on getting Russian forces out of Europe and nuclear non-proliferation. We do little else to help them in any way that they find meaningful, or found meaningful. And so their images that they understand of their 1990s is pensions that no longer mean anything. So you see, all the various granddads and grandmothers just selling their stuff on the street. And the big gain of this period, McDonald's, which is great in a certain way, but just to think, by the time we get to the new guy, this is a country that went from we are a superpower to we lost our empire, we lost our country, and we lost our economy in just one single decade. So when we can then try to understand the motivations of what President Putin is trying to do, it's in effect to say, all of this was bad, we're going to blame everything on the Americans, and the only thing that I'll be doing for the rest of my time in office is trying to get us back to where we were, to the moment that we'll never be as powerful as the United States. And even today, no one in Moscow will say, we will never be as wealthy as the Chinese. So even if the US is number one, China's number two, we're still number three, and the distance between three and everybody else is so great as to make us a great power that matters. That's this whole thing. And so when we think about how do we understand what Russia wants and what Russia wants out of this war, make the world look more like 89 than 91, which means limit the power of the West, return Russia to the upper echelon of great powers, and create a new multipolar era of international relations. A world in which Russia matters. That's essentially what he's trying to get out of Ukraine. And so in their decades of conflict in between the end of the Soviet Union and really through the Syrian intervention, everything is a special operation of increasingly larger size. And so a special operation in the military context means you're going to do one specific thing. Once you accomplish that task, you have succeeded, which is different from, how many people here have served in the military? You get a couple. So all of our military planning is based on we're going to go somewhere and we're going to level it until we have it. That's essentially the point of why the defense budget is so big, is because we plan for really big operations and we're ready for them. Whereas for the Russians, they recognize in Chechnya, and the picture there on the top left, that's Grozny, that's the capital of Chechnya. The Chechens tried to secede by saying, well, if the East Germans could go and the Lithuanians could go, well, what about us? We were just conquered at a different point in time as well. And the Russian state went in, if you remember from the 1990s, and flattened it. That picture there on the top left is a Russian city. So what we've seen over the past number of years of what the Russians did to Aleppo in Syria, what they did to Mariupol, they're totally willing to do that to their own towns. No compunction at all. That wasn't too much of a success, but from Georgia, which is there at the top right, Russian forces on their way to the capital, and to Crimea, they had a specific way of war that had one big idea in mind. Avoid NATO, avoid the United States. As long as they can keep basically external forces out of it, they'll probably have enough capabilities to defeat these relatively small, relatively ineffectual rivals. And part of that is understanding, a lot of things that we heard over the last number of years, how are the Russians able to use information, interfering in, let's say, the US presidential election, is by having a sense of what are the images that they need in order to create a perception of victory that may or may not already be there. And this, at the bottom left, is one of my favorite pictures of all time. because when the Russians went into Crimea, if you look carefully at this picture, you see there's a cat. Cats, notoriously like skittish, recalcitrant creatures. Also, children, you could say the same thing. You might notice that if a person, an adult, is handing a cat to a child, that indicates that no one is perturbed by this situation. And you focus on this act instead of the fact that this guy is heavily armed and doesn't have any insignia on him. One of the great things about this picture is that, to use a little bit of Alex Jones talk in here, the cat and the kid are both crisis actors. That's a trained cat. There is a statue of this picture that is in Sevastopol in Crimea today. They brought a trained cat, they found the kid locally, they put him in the jacket, which is in Ukraine's colors. And so producing this picture in order to send it around the world, to convey to the world, it's what the people of Crimea want. That's why when they look at these operations, this Crimea is in fact their apex of success. So as long as they avoid any well-armed adversary, everything else they've worked through over the years. They also learn from America's wars. At the top left there, that is Major General Donahue. He was the last US soldier to exit Afghanistan. And as we see here, President Trump, dealing with, European allies, or global allies. And there's also the recently assassinated Prime Minister of Japan on his side. It's at a G7 meeting. Is that what America learned is that the United States is so advanced technologically. There's no way that any country on earth could reasonably expect survival in any sort of conflict. And even when they think about what the Chinese would do, they would think this goes to nuclear weapons pretty quickly. So as long as they avoid actually dealing with the United States and our allies and partners, what they can do is make sure that NATO is not unified. They can make sure that let's say the publics in United States, in France, in Germany, don't really care about any outside issues, take advantage of this war weariness. So if they can break up Western unity and act quickly enough for the slow-moving West, slow-moving NATO to not do anything about it, that should be enough in order to be successful in whatever it is that they wanted to do. And that's the context in which we get to the political goals of Russia and Ukraine. As I said, they wanted to eliminate Ukraine as a quote-unquote normal European country because if Russia wants to be a great power, they need to have the biggest possible sphere of influence. And Belarus and Kazakhstan and Armenia and Kyrgyzstan are all wonderful places to go visit. I've been to all of them. They're all delights in their own ways, but they're not going to really move the needle. Ukraine is the largest European country outside of Russia itself that is not in the EU. It is a country of 40 to 45 million people. It is the bridge to the West. A Russia that controls Ukraine is a Russia that is able to shape questions of European security. So in effect, Putin put himself into this strategic corner. He wants to be taken seriously as a great power, but great powers have these big networks, these big sets of allies, these big sets of partners. So if he doesn't have Ukraine, or at least a Ukraine that is broken enough to not really matter in any sort of international politics, then essentially he's bet it all on this. And so the Russians, and that's this, I was about to say Soviet foreign minister, but the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, and that's obviously like Ukrainians with the EU flag and the Ukrainian flag in Kyiv in their central square, the Maidan. What Russia's demands to the broader West and to Ukraine before, as they were gathering, more than 100,000 troops and ultimately 190,000 troops on Ukraine's borders by February 2022, is that both Ukraine and the broader West had to cancel themselves, to use a sort of contemporary language. So as long as Ukraine kicked out anyone who had participated in politics from the Maidan, when they went on a more pro-Western orientation, they would have to kick everyone out of politics who participated since then. So bring back, the people who are more pro-Russia, abandon any weapons that might threaten Russia, which again, once you share a border, technically speaking, a rock, if you're standing at the border, can be a threat to the other side if you've got a good enough arm. And accept that Ukraine would just lose its territory. That NATO and the US would have to remove all the military infrastructure from countries that joined from 1997 onwards, when NATO started expanding. So that means that NATO would have to give up the Baltic partners, just straight up. That they would have to guarantee no new members, that they would have to halt all activities in the former Soviet Union, and this includes Turkey winning Azerbaijan's wars for it, and remove all nuclear weapons from Europe. So in effect, this is what Putin was betting on, is that by making demands that were so high that he was going to expose in the West that no one cares about Ukraine. That's what he thought was going to happen, that some combination of these demands would be met, and that, in effect, Ukraine would be abandoned at the first instance. And it didn't work. And that's, in effect, where we are over the past year. By telegraphing another war, through Minsk Accords and all that, for about 8 years, and having a concerted buildup for a full year. The first Russian troops went to the Ukrainian border in April 2021. You might remember President Biden, President Putin met in Switzerland in June 2021. So by the time we get to February 2022, it's pretty clear, like, this is going to happen. The Biden team, they rapidly and consistently declassified all of the false flag attempts that Russia was going to use as a pretext for conflict. So, part of the thing that the Russians were anticipating is that because the US had, not used intelligence well when thinking about, the argument to go into Iraq in 2002, that no one would believe the US. But because we declassified the information, because we did so in a way that revealed the truth as it was emerging, the Russians were left flat-footed. We also know, and this is something that is coming out in the news over the next couple weeks, is because all of this started in April 21 and the war doesn't happen until February 22, the Treasury Department was working with all of its counterparts around the world and its coalition to create a set of sanctionable targets. Sorry, a bit of feedback here. And so the strategy, the operational concept, the logistics, and the tactics all failed to cohere. The broad sanctions regime has arrested Russia's ability to advance as a modern economy. And that's in effect what Biden and his team were doing from April 21 to February 22, so that when the war actually happened, they were just implementing, rather than having to decide things on the spot. And so here, what we say the major military objectives, for those of you, again, who have been in the military, they basically had plan A and no other plans. They thought they were going to effectively take a city of several million within 3 days, that they would just kill or capture or otherwise force into exile Zelensky and his team, and that would be just the end of Ukraine. That they would do that in 3 days and spend the next 10 plus days just collecting surrenders from around the country. And one of the big questions is why, and it's become clear over the past year, is that everyone in the Russian military and Russian intelligence services simply didn't believe anything this asinine or this ludicrous would happen. So of course, when the boss was saying, are the armies in the field ready? Do we have all the logistics ready? Has the Ukrainian battle space been prepared? Everyone's like, sure, boss. How long will this take? Will this take a week? No, we can do this in 3 days. All you have to do is say yes. And what we have in terms of the human sources around Putin, as well as the signals intelligence that have been captured, and reported in, like the Washington Post, New York Times over the past year, is that in effect, Putin, because of his COVID isolation, one of the descriptions that I heard that was the most crazy is that someone described it was like a person who got addicted to social media, and the algorithm just kept feeding more and more radical stuff. Because the people who said, yes, boss, we can take a country of 45 million people in 3 days, those are the people who got the repeat invitations. So then you get the competition around all the other people in the team. The more stuff that you tell the boss that the boss wants to hear, that's more FaceTime with the boss. As we know, think of how valuable the FaceTime is with any executive, and particularly think the leader of a country. And so he got himself just like whipped into this lather that he was going to basically take, this entire country. So because they did that, they did not, in effect, were not successful in their first conflict. They failed to conceive that the Ukrainians were fighting for their homes, just like their literal houses, but also their language, their culture, their sovereignty, their ability to exist as an independent country. And so because the intelligence services had told them they'll be welcoming us with open arms, they simply weren't prepared for the fight that happened. So they wanted to fight against something that was basically a little bit bigger than Syria and like the Syrian forces that were against Assad. And it turns out that over the course of the past year, they've effectively fought some version of a NATO-capable army. And one of the sort of, black humor jokes over the course of the past year is that Ukraine is basically evolving into 21st century military because they're getting all basically like NATO weapons at the same time that Russia is transitioning into a 20th century military because they're running out of the microchips and the semiconductors that they need in order to make modern weaponry. And so this is why we've seen in terms of what are Russian tactics now, they're basically clearing out Russia's prisons in order to send like the felons just directly, people with automatic weapons going against, armored vehicles. And that is what we've seen over the course of the past year, is that President Putin does not have much regard for the preservation of human life, not just of his adversary, but of his own people. So part of what we can think about in terms of how long this war is going to last is that President Putin is clearly very, very comfortable with hundreds of thousands of Russian casualties. And again, this is me on Bloomberg, and I like the chyron there. Sanctions are beyond what anyone had anticipated. So basically, every part of Russia is sanctioned. It doesn't mean that they still don't sell energy. Like, we'll get to that in a second. It doesn't mean that they can't, import things. It just means that they can't import the best available of whatever. And they can't import anything from the broader sanctions coalition, which is, about 65 countries. And obviously, oil and gas exports, that's where we are now. Russian deglobalization, again, more than half of Russia's foreign exchange reserves are now frozen in Europe. Most of their basically economic ability to interact with the outside world has been canceled. And in that regard, the things that they can still bring in, because there's no major shipping firms that operate to and from Russia, is they have a system, what they call parallel imports. Sanctions evasion and trying to basically get new overland imports instead of by sea or by air. And so what have they done over the past year to try to improve their odds of success? One, create food insecurity. As you can see there at the top, this is just a picture of a Ukrainian field just being burned. Just reduce Ukraine's ability to export food, which we can go into the Q&A period. This was in effect creating an issue of food insecurity in the global south, particularly North Africa and the Middle East. And the strategy there was very explicit, that if there is food insecurity in the Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, well, this will create civil instability. And if there's civil instability, well, that means migrants will come to Europe. And that's what they were trying to create in order to put pressure on the Europeans to reduce the support they were giving to Ukraine. Create an energy crisis, and it just so happened that there was a warm winter. The EU, in terms, and we'll get to this in a second, the energy crisis didn't occur as they wanted. And to create essentially the demand in Europe and abroad for, what I put there is enough already. Let's bring this war to an end, get that sentiment going. But what we've seen across most of Europe is that, I was in Finland I was in Sweden the day that Finland announced that it was starting its accession procedures to NATO. And I was there at a military conference. It was basically the Swedish version of National Defense University. And I asked basically this Finnish captain who was sitting right beside me, I was like, what do you think about this? And he said, from our perspective, the Russians keep saying that they like Ukraine and that they consider the Ukrainians to be brothers. If this is what they do to their family, imagine what they do to people they don't like. And that over the course of the past year is basically what people in Europe have thought about this conflict, is that it's so insane that either they live with it or they try to bring it to an end. And so far, most of European public opinion is on trying to contain Russia where available. So the European energy market, this is one of the most, in effect, important on the left there. On the right, you see Putin at the top, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz on the right, and the head of the European Union Commission. So within the EU, there is the European Parliament, which represents the people. There is the European Council, which represents all the different states. But the European Commission represents Europe as a whole. And the lady there, Ursula von der Leyen, she made, in effect, the big policy decision for the EU at the beginning, is that this is, in essence, the one crisis that will help redefine Europe for the next generation and beyond. That if she framed it as it was a challenge to Europe and as an opportunity to reach all the climate goals, because that Europe has tried to do for the last 20 to 30 years. Because so long as Germany relies on cheap Russian energy to fund its economy, it's been hard to really get moving on lots of their climate goals. But because the shock was felt by the Germans as well, this was the moment to reframe how does Russia deal with Europe at a much more arm's length distance. And so the graph there on the left is, in effect, EU's diversification away from Russian gas. Whereas Russia used to provide, roughly speaking, 50 to 60% of European energy for a great number of years, primarily through Germany, it is now about 25%. In effect, LNG from the United States and Qatar, other places, as well as from Norway, those are also about 25% each. Algeria is about 11%, and various other countries are the rest. And so the ability of Europe to no longer be reliant on Russian energy, but just to have Russian energy as part of their energy profile, that's one of the big generational outcomes of this conflict. And in the energy markets, this is where you guys are now. The West has, broadly speaking, has created an energy buyer's cartel. We have instituted caps of $60 per barrel crude, $100 for refined petroleum products, $45 for other refined products, which limits the revenue to Russia. And in the top left, you can see that is basically Russia's oil and gas revenues. The top right, where have they essentially gone to if they can't export to the West? Primarily Asia. India and China have really upped their imports. But here's the way that the price cap work. On the technical sense, it's about prohibiting, Western companies like shipping, insurance, et cetera, from providing services to Russian imports if they pay above the price cap. But the real hammer is actually what you see there on the top right, and you put it all together in terms of what's happening at the bottom left, or at the bottom. That graph on the bottom, that is the Urals price, which is what Russia sells for, and the Brent price, the international price of oil. The lower that goes, that's the bigger the discount that the Russians have to offer relative to international prices. The Indians and the Chinese are importing more, but they're effectively using the Western price as the discount that they're asking for. So the Russians continue to export tremendous amounts, but they just get less per barrel and less per cubic meter. And so they're at the point where right now, their revenue commodities are about 45% of income, and their spending is obviously through the roof because they have to not only pay for the war, but they also have to pay for all the other social services in order to maintain some semblance of stability at home. So where we can see in terms of putting it all together, Russia's National Wealth Fund, which is basically like their savings account. Governments are not families are not individuals, but to the extent that we can look at all of the money that Russia has, because they can't issue bonds because those are sanctioned, Russia has, just at the current level of spending and the current level of predicted income, they have enough money to last as a going concern until about 2025. At that point, Russia has run out of money. So when we're thinking about what motivates Putin now, He has to win this war this year. Because if he doesn't win it this year, next year, he's in a pickle. And if he doesn't win in 24, in 25, the ability to win looks to be well nigh impossible. And so at this point, thank you for your attention, and I would like to ask any questions. The bells are chiming.
Hello. Hi, I'm Monty Shaw. I'm with a group called the IRA.
Yeah.
IRFA. Wow, I should know where I work. Been a long day. We were talking last night, and I thought maybe you could expand on, there are some folks, primarily on the right, that frustrate me because they say, oh, why give another $40 billion in aid to Ukraine when, we got stuff to do here at home? I personally don't think those two things in a country our size are mutually exclusive. I also think that the cost to the United States in preventing Russia from being a serious player in a multipolar world, what we're doing with Ukraine is pennies on the dollar. But what you're the expert, so you tell me what you think.
It's a great question. So when you put together at this point all of the various sources of aid, the United States has roughly given, in terms of both military aid to the Ukraine state budget, humanitarian assistance, all of it. Roughly speaking, maybe 12% of the annual DoD budget. Our entire national security strategy, national defense strategy, says China is the pacing threat, Russia is the acute threat. So for roughly speaking, somewhere between 10 and 15% of the DoD's annual budget, we are deleting Russia as a great power. So to me, that seems to be a worthwhile investment. And then when we think more broadly, what is the effect of Russia's essentially, the difficulties Russia is facing, is that China and Taiwan, which is essentially the thing that occupies a lot of us, China looks at this and they say, or they think to themselves, are we prepared to do something that's even bigger than that? Because Russia and Ukraine, they share a border. How is China going to get across the South China Sea? And so they think, logistically, do we have everything in place? 2, what are the lessons that the Taiwanese are taking from the Ukrainians? And taking, in a sense, the lesson, the Ukrainians made the entire world on their side, and they resisted mightily. So our entire relationship with Taiwan is basically, at this point, ensuring that Taiwan replicates what Ukraine has done. And then the third big point in terms of using this conflict to help deter conflict between China and Taiwan is China can look and see it for themselves. If the United States can put together roughly 60 to 65 countries to bring Russia to an end, arresting their ability to advance as a modern economy, helping to destroy their armies in the field, and in effect removing them from great power politics without committing a single soldier. What is China going to do if the United States does participate in the next conflict? So in effect, this is a big demonstration for what the United States can do, particularly by showing what we can do without participating directly. But thank you. Sir?
John Norwood. Two quick questions. One would be tactical nuclear weapons. What keeps Russia from not using those? And then number 2, thinking about Putin. If Putin is no longer there, is there a succession plan? What do you think happens if Putin isn't there?
2 great questions. So a couple months ago, there was a lot of discussion about whether Russia would bomb a nuclear power plant that they captured, whether they would use tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine. And in effect, within the space of roughly 24 hours, President Biden, President Macron of France, and José Manuel Barroso, who's the EU foreign policy chief, they all said some version of the response from the broader West will be conventional and it'll be devastating. So what does that translate into? The ability of the United States to delete Russia's Black Sea fleet, as well as armies in the field, was considered to be credible enough that the Russians haven't talked about it since. So in a sense, we're seeing how deterrence works. Like deterrence, you can't see it. Although if you have movie night coming up, Dr. Strangelove is always a great classic to revisit on the subject. But what the Russians took from that was they can deter the United States and NATO broadly from participating directly in the conflict. At the same time, that when President Biden says, I'll defend every inch of NATO territory, we are sending billions of dollars of military equipment directly into Ukraine that has no other purpose except to allow Ukraine to defend itself. And that means doing harm onto the Russians who are invading. The Russians have not bombed a single one of those supply routes. So, part of these tactical nuclear weapons versus conventional threats is about defining what are the parameters of what the US will and will not do. So I think that sort of captures that. In terms of what happens if Putin goes, Russia has a constitution, so there's a procedure. The prime minister becomes the acting president. The acting president then has to call for elections in the span of 100 days. So we have basically the government structure and then an unholy war of all against all. Because the one key thing that Putin has done in the 20 plus years he's been in power is that he's made a system in which he can motivate, keep basically power from himself to his subordinates, to their subordinates, so on and so forth, till you get to the smallest bureaucrat in the dustiest village in the most, backwoods Siberian town. That person then thinks, I have a boss who has a boss who has a boss, who eventually gets to Putin. So between vertical power and Putin being the person who can balance all the different elite factions, the reason that the elite haven't turned on him is because you remove him, who's to protect anyone from basically their colleagues, from their equals. That's essentially what keeps Putin in power. So if you remove him by the icy hand of death comes for us all, or someone wants to take him out, it'll be calm, but it's what Winston Churchill said about Kremlin politics. You only know who's won. It's like bulldogs fighting underneath the carpet. You only know who won by who's able to walk out. That's in effect what we could probably see over the following months. And again, if movie night's coming up, just watch Death of Stalin. This basically will tell you everything you need to know about how well organized succession is in Russia. So thank you very much for your attention.
Dr. Weber, thank you for that wonderful and thought-provoking conversation. I'm sure there'll be plenty of follow-up questions for people out in the audience. Please join me in thanking Dr. Weber again.